Hi, everyone. I'm Katina McHenry. You are joining us on our Big Idea Show, where we take a deeper look at faculty research happening here in the McCombs School of Business. Joining me today is one of my favorite faculty members, Amit Kumar. He's Assistant Professor of Marketing and Psychology, and we're talking about a brand new paper today called Overly Shallow, Miscalibrated Expectations Create a Barrier to Deeper Conversations. So I am so excited, as I always am, Amit, to talk to you about this because your research is so incredibly relevant to such a broad audience. So first, welcome to today's show, and then we'll talk about your paper. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm always happy to chat with you. Hopefully our conversations help people live lives that are at least slightly better. So we'll see if we can help people learn some things that might make them a little bit happier today.
Yes, of course. Well, I want to summarize your paper because I think in the year and a half of COVID, where we were isolated and at home and not really interacting as much with people in person, that really changed how we converse and interact with just the public. So I think your paper is so relevant and timely because it talks about how to make deeper connections, but also the barriers that keep us from making deeper connections when it comes to just interacting and conversing with strangers. So tell me a little bit about the background of the paper and where your idea to work on this came from.
Where this research came from was sort of, if sociality is known to be so good for us, a question that we've sort of been thinking about is whether people are actually social enough for their own well-being in their daily lives. So we have lots and lots of opportunities for social engagement. What we were trying to do here was look sort of at how wisely people choose how to engage with others. So what we find is that folks tend to underestimate that tendency towards sociality in other people. So we assume that other people are somewhat indifferent towards us. That can lead us to think that sort of a deeper, more meaningful, more intimate conversation would be really awkward and uncomfortable. Those beliefs, which turn out to be misguided, can lead us to avoid sort of these deeper, more meaningful conversations when we'd likely be happier and better off if we dug a little bit deeper than we typically do when we're interacting with others.
It's so interesting though, because like we all do this. We create this narrative in our minds of how we expect something to turn out or how we expect the conversation to go. And if in our head we imagine it's going to be a negative experience, we shy away from it.
Our sort of main finding is that people really just underestimate the positivity of these deeper conversations. In other experiments, we also had people come up with deeper conversation topics themselves. And so they just came up with topics that were they came up with topics that they normally discuss, and then we kind of pushed them to think about something that's a little bit deeper than what they would normally discuss. So what that means is that people are capable of sort of generating these more meaningful conversation topics themselves.
So in the experiment, were the participants all strangers or did some of them know each other? And I wonder, but depending on how you answer that, what was the main difference between the questions you gave people who may have known each other and versus people who didn't know each other at all?
So we looked at both sort of types of relationships, close and more distant relationships. But the questions that we had people ask among their interaction partners across these relationships were actually the same. And so basically what we find is that for both close and distant others, these deeper conversations lead to sort of stronger bonds. So the actual experiences are very similar. We really seem to enjoy having these more meaningful conversations. They're not as awkward and uncomfortable as we expect. The difference between relationship types is we sort of get that when we're interacting with our romantic partners or our family members. We're not as miscalibrated. We understand that it's not going to be as uncomfortable to talk about things that you really care about, your future, what you aspire towards, your passions, things like that with people that you're close to. Where people seem to be really off the mark is when they're interacting with people that they don't know quite as well. The other thing that I'll say about sort of like the types of people and the types of interactions, one of the things that's sort of somewhat surprising, I think, is how robust and reliable these effects are. So we tested these effects with college students, with online participants, with MBA students, with international MBA students from around the world, with people who just happened to be in a public park. We had executives at a financial services firm. So you can imagine these
Oh my gosh.
older business executives talking about the last time they cried in front of another person. And across all of these different samples of participants, we find sort of the same effects. We also tested whether miscalibration varies by sort of personality. The results suggest that it doesn't. So the same effects for extroverts and introverts. We also don't see differences based on gender. We even tested our hypotheses over Zoom. So for conversations like what we're having now, rather than in-person conversations, that kind of allows us to see how generalizable these effects are. And our results were the same when people connected over video chat. So deep conversations are still significantly more positive than people anticipate, and participants still overestimate how awkward those interactions are going to be.
So how would you advise someone to start? Like what, I know some of the icebreaker questions, how would you advise people to even start a conversation that leads to a deeper conversation, that leads to a deeper connection?
So I think I have a couple answers to that. One of those, it probably just has to do with like, what are deep conversations in the first place? Maybe that sounds a little ambiguous when I say that phrase. Deep conversations are basically ones that involve self-disclosure in some way. So sort of revealing some personally intimate information about what you're thinking or feeling or experiencing. So I gave you some examples. The examples that we came up with were actually, they were taken from what researchers call the fast friends paradigm. So this procedure actually became somewhat well known because it was written about in a really popular New York Times column a few years ago. They referred to them as the 36 questions to fall in love. You might not fall in love with everyone that you have a deep and meaningful conversation with, but you are likely to feel more connected to them and to enjoy your interaction more when you sort of dive a little bit deeper. So that is sort of like what we mean by deep conversations. But the real advice, as we've talked about in other contexts too, I think is to just do it. So one thing that we find in these, like just basically dive in. You know, if we think these things are going to be awkward, that's going to lead us to decide not to do it. And that can be problematic because we don't experiment, we don't try, we don't see what it actually would be like if we did it. More calibrated expectations can kind of encourage deeper conversations. So part of what we're hoping with here is that research that kind of documents that interactions don't always unfold in the way that we anticipate. One way in which we can have deeper conversations more often in our daily lives is to try doing it a couple times. You'll learn that it's not as uncomfortable or awkward as you expected, that you actually liked it more than you anticipated. Once you realize that, you might just do this more often. But if you just always have these concerns about awkwardness kind of standing in the way of trying it in the first place, you'll never have the opportunity to learn that your expectations might have been wrong.
Yeah, I love that. So did any of the participants at the end of the study leave as friends?
We didn't follow up with people later, but we did get a measure of sort of whether they actually wanted to be friends with these strangers. Like, so they were interacting with people for the first time. We asked them how much, how interested would you be in talking to this person again later on and becoming friends with this person? And when you have a deep conversation, you're more interested in actually developing a relationship. So what's interesting is that people actually want deeper and more intimate relationships. That's how strangers become our friends and our spouses. And so that's what we want in life, but we're sort of reluctant to pursue these things because we worry that this greater intimacy is going to be awkward or uncomfortable.
How a part of that narrative that we create in our head, how much of it has to do with whether or not we feel like the other person actually cares about what we have to say? And for me, like, it goes back to that question of when you ask somebody how you're doing, and it's like, it's twofold. It's like, you're asking them how they're doing out of courtesy, but for some people, like, you really don't want to know because it's going to go into a very long explanation.
if you tried giving the longer answer, maybe they would care. It's sort of a more interesting thing to talk about, right? Like if
Yeah.
you say, oh, I'm fine, not much is going on, or it looks like it's going to rain today or something like that, then they're not going to care very much about your answer to that question. But if you say, oh, my kid's back at school and they have to wear their double masking and it's a lot harder to readjust to life because of that, that's an interesting conversation. I care about the fact that you're sharing that information with me. And in fact, I'm probably even likely to reciprocate and share more with you than I would have otherwise.
Do you think someone's reluctance to have a deeper conversation has to do with culture and or upbringing?
It's definitely a hard question to answer because we haven't tested half of the people on the planet or anything like that. We did test, there's about 2,000 people, a little less than 2,000 people in the various experiments that we conducted. My prediction would be that, yeah, culture does tend to matter a lot. Personality characteristics matter a lot. Your upbringing could matter a lot. But where it tends to matter is in your expectations, not necessarily in your experiences. So they might affect how you think people are going to respond to you, whether they care about you or not. But it doesn't necessarily affect whether they actually care about you and how they really do respond to you.
This is so interesting. Okay, so Amit, when's the last time you cried and what made you cry?
Well, Katina, I'm always a little nervous that someone's going to ask me this question when I talk about this research, but I'll be honest about it because I know that you're likely to care. Turns out that I actually got married this summer and
What?
I shed a tear or two that day.
Oh my gosh, congratulations. I had no idea. See what happens when you don't see people?
And what happens when you dig a little deeper? I probably wouldn't have talked about that if we were just talking about the research that's in the paper, but because you asked a more meaningful, more interesting question, you learned something interesting about me.
Oh my gosh. Well, this has been such a great conversation. I'm glad we had a chance to go deeper. And I love that. I love the topic. I love what you guys learned from your research. And I love that we are now trying to be better about having a deeper conversation, and you're encouraging others. And here are ways to do it. And I love that. So if you would like to read Amit's full paper, it is called Overly Shallow, Miscalibrated Expectations Create a Barrier to Deeper Conversation. And we'll have a link in the description of this video. Thank you so much, Amit. It's always great to see you. Congratulations again. And thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks a lot, Katina.
Yeah.